Welcome to the Cities Podcast, powered by the Business Journal's Leadership Trust. Each episode on Cities looks at a particular topic, challenge, trend, or political situation through the lens of local markets. Our contributors are members of Business Journal's Leadership Trust.
Hey everyone, this is Stephen Ganoza. This is our third episode in a series called Startup Nation, where we talk with members of the Leadership Trust about what cities are doing to attract and retain talent and businesses. We'll also discuss lessons learned by those cities that have already become hubs for startups and early stage companies, and how other cities can apply those lessons as they seek to attract businesses. Today, we have my interview with Ed Barrientos. Ed lives and works in Washington, D.C., where he is a member of the Washington Business Journal Leadership Trust and the chairman and CEO of Brazen Technologies, a high-growth tech company in the cloud-based HR software space. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So before we get into talking about the scene in Washington, let's talk about Brazen a little bit. What problem are you solving for your clients?
Sure. You know, when we started, we recognized that many individuals, people that are looking for jobs, people that are looking to perhaps move to a new job, wanted to have an opportunity to actually, talk, communicate in some way with a recruiter or an employer before deciding to move forward. And what was really interesting that we found when the company was founded was that very few employers actually ever gave individuals that were interested in working for them an opportunity to talk to them before they applied. Typically when you think of a job search process, you never get to actually communicate with the employer until you have been either chosen, selected for an interview, or later. And what we realized is that for most people, I'll say top talent, they want to get a sense for what this job really is, and it's something that can't just be done by looking at a job, requisition or a job listing. So we felt like the opportunity was there to actually open up channels of communication between candidates and recruiters in this case, to allow for more people to understand that this opportunity was there, and perhaps they would be interested in moving further, including applying. And the problem that was there was the fact that, especially right now in a tight labor market, you often have people that will look at a job listing somewhere, and less than 1%, or maybe even less than half of a percent, actually ever apply. So that means that a lot of people either are filtering themselves right away out of the job opportunity and are saying, yeah, I don't like this. Or, and this was our hypothesis, and it's turned out to be the case, many just, there wasn't enough information there for them to move forward, and then they just moved on. So that's the problem, or the pain point that we saw, is how do we get more top talent to actually decide to move forward and apply and hopefully get hired by top employers.
So functionally and practically speaking, then, this is from the applicant side of it, you would come across a job posting, and then there'd be a way to interact with somebody at the company to be like, hey, this looks interesting. I want to ask a few questions before I spend an hour writing a cover letter and doing all this other stuff.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And what we realized early on, when we started, we created what is called a virtual event platform. It allowed candidates that had questions to sort of meet virtually online and chat with individual recruiters. But as time went on, we've developed a whole range, and you mentioned it in your intro, a whole range of different tools, communication methods. For example, some jobs now have the opportunity to chat immediately using live chat, if you will, with a recruiter or even a hiring manager. Others are fine interacting with a chat bot that provides some basic questions and answers to sort of frequently asked questions. Others want to join an online event where they get a chance to meet or hear about the opportunity, maybe see a little bit more about the employer. We work with some of the top employers to make that possible, to give candidates options in which to communicate with employers.
You mentioned that a lot of potential applicants self-filter themselves out, maybe because of lack of information, or the job posting maybe isn't clear. Your tools, this system, what's the impact on not only the quantity of people who apply, but the quality of people who apply, with this option to kind of have a little pre-application interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the industry, in the recruiting industry, there is a term called a passive candidate. The passive candidate is someone that is most likely working somewhere now, happens to see a job listing or hears about a job opportunity, and is sort of curious. And it may browse that. They don't have any specific uh, you know momentum or desire necessarily to change jobs, but they're kind of interested because this is an interesting opportunity. Those individuals are often the most prized by employers. They are seen as the majority of the potential candidate pool out there is that way. If you're and this is perhaps unfair to say, but there tends to be a bit of a negative bias on someone that is unemployed and looking to apply to a job. There's just a bias that assumes if you're good at what you do, then you're probably working, and therefore you're a passive candidate. Well, passive candidates are probably the most difficult to convince to actually take a step, to actually take action and move further down the hiring funnel, maybe by applying or something. So by actually almost targeting those passives and making it as easy as possible, sort of a no strings attached chat with a recruiter, we actually get more of those passive candidates to take that step, which results typically in better, what employers will say are better quality hires ultimately. So that's sort of the mechanics, if you will, behind that, and why oftentimes being able to have that kind of a easy way to communicate with recruiters early in the process improves the quality of your hires.
And I imagine when you have higher quality candidates, that they're more suited for the position, so the general time to hire is then shortened for a company.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it typically, again, if you are if you're able to get those individuals that are already, you kind of know that they're going to probably do well in your assessments and the interviews and so forth. And if you can get more of those from the get go, then yeah, you're likely to increase, or I should say, decrease your time to hire. It'll be faster to get the person through the process. The other thing to keep in mind also, because in recruiting there are sort of two primary KPIs that people look for. I'll even say three, and I'll explain. Number one is what you just mentioned, which is the time to hire. Everyone wants to shorten that. The other one is the cost to hire. How expensive is it to hire someone? And finally, it's the candidate experience. Every company today wants to provide a nicer, more empathetic candidate process. They realize that's really important. It reflects their brand. So those are sort of the three KPIs. We talked about the time to hire, but if you think about all the money that is spent to advertise job listings, large companies will spend millions and millions. So being able to actually keep more of the people that could be actual hires in the process really affects your cost to hire. So that's another reason why, if you like, recruiting is very much of a marketing process. You have leads, you're advertising out there and you get leads, and you want to convert those leads. You want to convert quality leads into, not sales like you would in marketing, but actual hires. So the process is actually very similar, and a lot of the KPIs are similar. And as you've seen in the marketing or consumer world, when you go on a site and you want to order, you're thinking about buying something, and if you have questions, and let's say you're on Amazon or some other site, and you're looking at a product, you think this is maybe what you want, but there are a couple of questions that are keeping you from buying. Being able to have an opportunity to immediately chat with somebody from the company that can answer some questions or give them a quick call really can make a difference between you buying that product or just leaving, because you're not sure, and therefore you leave and you may never come back. You may forget about the fact that you were interested. Same thing applies here in recruiting. Again, if you have quality leads, in this case candidates that are coming to your site and are looking at your job, you don't want them to go away because they have questions that are not answered in that job description.
Right, right. So that all makes sense. And the candidate experience is something that we hear a lot about these days.
Yeah.
I kind of want to go back to this idea of, a bias towards passive
Yep.
candidates. Does any of your technologies, do they do anything to help active candidates or to help remove that stigma, if you will?
Yeah, it does. I ultimately, even for active candidates, if I know I see a job and I think this is the perfect job for me, the last thing we want to do is create barriers or friction points that say to that individual, hey, before we let you apply, first, why don't we chat, or why don't you go through and ask questions and we'll answer them. If someone really, sometimes it just clicks. We do everything we can to allow that process. Our software, our job as a company is to make that candidate experience as positive as possible. And if you are one of those individuals that knows this is the job for me, we make it really easy for you to get quickly through to the apply uh, process and move forward. So we are not, we are not biased against the actives. What I will tell you is that in a time when unemployment is so low, the number of actives is just not enough to fill positions right now. So you have to, almost by default, you have to go after passives, people that are working, that maybe have a very casual interest in something, and you kind of have to sell them. Again, I'll go back to my marketing example. There are a lot of companies in a time when unemployment is low. There are a lot of companies that may want to hire you. So each one of those companies has to do a better job of convincing you, the candidate, that you should go through this process with them. And part of that is making yourself available, being there to answer those questions. So I think actives definitely have a way in. But in a time when there's so few active seekers right now, it's important for employers to really also find ways of being able to engage those passive candidates.
So before we move on to sort of the business scene in
Yep.
Washington, because we do want to cover that,
Yep.
just one last question about the product. Do you have any metrics on the effectiveness of Brazen Technologies versus, say, a program that filters out resumes on keywords or something like that?
Yeah. Again, I'm gonna go back to what I just said about one size does not fit all. I think there are lots of different technologies that aim at different sectors. Some are great for very, I'll say relatively low skill seasonal or hourly workers. Automation tends to work better there. Where you can do pretty simple screening. Technology still is not where it would need to be to replace human beings. We happen to believe that you're never going to replace the human element in the recruiting process. We actually work hard to actually make the human touch piece scalable. We realize that it's hard. You can't always chat with everybody, but our technology has been focused from day one on making human touch actually scalable and efficient. So, I would say from a metrics perspective, what we have seen, and I'll start with the very top of the funnel, is that by providing options for a candidate to actually engage with an employer outside of just an apply button, you can get up to 2x, sometimes 3x improvements in conversion rates. So that means that, let's say if you advertise a particular job and you somehow through that advertising you get 100 people to come to that job listing on your website. um, Typically you get maybe 1 or 2% that actually convert into an application. um, by growing that number and substantially increasing that number, you could imagine not only do you have more candidates that can perhaps increase the overall throughput and hopefully give you better quality, you're also getting more bang for your advertising dollars, because those people aren't just going away and leaving your website and your job listing immediately. So those are the types of very top of the funnel conversion numbers that we get. We in general, and this is more anecdotal because it's very difficult to know how someone is going to work out at a company. It takes sometimes years of collecting data to get that sense. We can tell you that we get great engagement to hire metrics from our customers. That means that people that engaged with them ahead of the application tend to be better hires and tend to hire at higher conversion rates. So those are the kinds of things. And again, it can depend greatly on the types of candidates and that you're looking at. But in general, I think we have proven and our customers see the net effect of providing engagement early in the process and how it improves the overall back end of the process, which is ultimately the hires.
Right. So for certain industries, having that pre-engagement or that engagement ahead of the application could be great. For something that's more geared towards active applicants, kind of seasonal work, as you say, technologies that just filter resumes might be suitable. So it does depend on use case.
It does to a certain degree. I would say that the more concentrated or compressed the process is, the less important perhaps early engagement is. So let's take someone that is being hired for a stadium concessions job. A stadium may be hiring 1,000 people, and the day they put on out the ad, they expect people to quickly apply, show up at the stadium, and get hired, sometimes within 24 hours. So that's a compressed hiring cycle, and it means that maybe having any kind of pre-engagement really doesn't have much of an effect because the whole process is so quick. Now shift to a nurse or shift to a developer. That may be weeks, if not months, in the making, right? You find out about a job, you think about it, you apply, you don't hear back, then you eventually hear back and get brought in. And so the longer the typical hiring cycle, the more important that engagement process is. I don't know if that answers your question, but I did want to give you sort of that general sense.
That totally makes sense. And I think that's very clear. I do want to pivot a little bit here, just being mindful of the time. We're running a bit long. I think we've got a good idea of what Brazen does, why it's beneficial to certain situations, and all that. Now, you're based in Washington, D.C., correct?
Well, Kind of. So
Kind of. Okay.
I want to caveat that we are in the Washington, D.C. area. I can see the monument from my office, but we are actually in Arlington, Virginia.
Got it. Okay. So, but you're in the, I guess, the DC metro area. Is that a fair description?
Absolutely fair description. Yeah.
We want to use these episodes as a way to check in about the local business scene while we have people from the markets. So I'm just wondering, what's your general sense of, the startup scene in DC? Is there one? How much of it is centered around the federal government?
There's definitely a startup scene in DC, and there has been one for many, many years, probably for, ever since there was a startup scene anywhere. Um, the startup scene here in DC goes, like everywhere else. Maybe in California, it's a little bit different in that it's kind of evergreen. In DC, you have waves, and you had big waves in the 80s. You had big waves in the late 90s. If people forget this, but the internet was born in the DC area. The first online sort of network was born in this area. You think back at AOL, you think back at at many of the telecoms. They all began here in this area, and people don't always remember that. But again, the cycle of innovation comes and goes, or I should say, the startup scene kind of is tied to the cycle of innovation. In the late, I'll say the 2007s, right before the recession, as you had things like social media and mobile devices starting to really blow up. You had huge number of startups. That was at the very beginning of that innovation cycle. You're getting kind of near. I mean, that cycle itself across the world is getting a bit old in the tooth. So that tends to, as you move and plateau near the end of an innovation cycle, there are probably less startups than at the beginning, but you now have a whole bunch of larger, startups that have grown, that have matured, that have been acquired, that have been acquiring others. So yeah, the DC area benefits from just a really, really smart population. We're probably the most highly educated, metro area in the entire country. We have just a lot of very educated people. So that's usually one of the key ingredients for having a tech scene. We're also just a large metro center, metro area with, I think it's 6.5 million people, affluent and highly educated. And that's just great sort of fodder for creating lots and lots of interesting startups.
So that's really interesting because Washington, D.C. just doesn't scream startup by reputation, I would say.
I think that one of the things I'll say about that is, DC, if other, the fact that we have the government, the politics, all the other things here overshadow the fact that there is a scene. Of course, that gets way more attention, and it probably should, given what it is. But it's just that we have a pretty diversified set of or economy here. We have a lot of industry, we have a lot of government, we have a lot of a lot of tech. So yeah, I mean, I get that it's overshadowed, but it's probably I don't know where we rank in the overall I'll say VC dollars that come in. But I would guess that we're in the top 10 of the regions. But given the size of the government, it just overshadows it. So that's where most of the press goes.
And are most startups tied to government work at all, or is it not a correlation?
There's really very little correlation. I mean, I would say that one new area, a relatively new area of you know, uh, of startup activity is cyber. That's a big area. We probably dominate here in terms of, given the fact that we do have the Pentagon, we have all the intelligence agencies here, cyber companies, startups are going to be somewhat connected. So I would say maybe in that market, cyber companies are a bit more government. Well, I'll say closer to government because of that. That's oftentimes the largest customer. But in general, I wouldn't say that there's a huge correlation between those.
Got it. So if you were doing it all over again, or if you move on to a new venture, would you do it in DC?
Yeah, I would. I think it's just look. I mean, you have. A good example of why anyone would want to do it is why Amazon has decided to move its HQ here, right? You've got to compared to San Francisco, compared to New York, or really anywhere in California, I would say we've got a great sort of trade-off between cost and availability of people. Try to hire people in San Francisco right now. It's just insane. And the costs are just out of this world. We have enormous amounts of talent here, but the cost is reasonable. Cost of living, cost of wages, all that is a pretty good mix. It's sort of the Goldilocks kind of economy in terms of a region. So, I think for that reason, I would definitely do that. You've got your dollars, your VC dollars will go a heck of a lot longer and further in DC than they would in other areas.
Regardless of what your take on the government is, DC's worth looking at for cost, for access to talent, to access to other cities, I imagine, and should not be overlooked.
That's exactly right.
Excellent. Great. Well, Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. This was a great discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I really appreciate it and look forward to talking again soon, hopefully.
If you missed our second episode in our series on Startup Nation,
in the 60s and 70s, Austin, the state of Texas, and particularly the University of Texas, came together that said Austin, the state's capital, ought to be a tech center. And everyone got together and started creating an ecosystem where entrepreneurship, particularly tech entrepreneurship, would thrive.
Check out the episode with Eugene Sepulveda from Austin, Texas, where we discuss whether or not Austin is still weird. That's all we have for today. As always, thank you for listening.
This has been the Cities Podcast, powered by the Business Journal's Leadership Trust. Please be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a member of a Business Journal's Leadership Trust and would like to participate in our podcast series, please email your member concierge. If you're interested in joining a Business Journal's Leadership Trust, learn more at trust.bizjournals.com.